Hello everyone, and welcome to the first tier list update. As I said in the previous tier list video, I'm going to try and update this every 6 months, give or take, so here we are. A few things I want to say before we get into it. You'll notice that there are some characters who were placed on the list last time are now back in the pool, and that's because I either forgot a few things about them, and I'm going to go a little more into them here, or there are some things that you guys mentioned in the comments that I want to go over before placing them again. So when we start, we'll be doing that first. But I also wanted to give you all a little more clarification on what the criteria for these tiers are. So for that I have this handy little image here, which should give you all a better idea of what I'm thinking when I'm placing these characters in these tiers. But there's also a little more to say here in regard to how I rank these characters. So depending on your own personal views and morals, you might view certain kinds of evil in different ways than I do. And that's perfectly fine. But for me, if a character or person has some sort of justification for their actions, I'm more inclined to rank them lower on the scale of evil. For example, a character like Palpatine, who has no justification for his actions beyond a selfish desire to gain power, is in my view much more evil than, say, Thanos, who we can at least say is doing what he's doing for a good reason. Though that reason isn't really good, but at least you can say he's not just a megalomaniac or a sadistic murderer who only kills people for his own pleasure. And while the scale of someone's crimes does matter to me, as far as ranking them goes, I'm more concerned whether or not there's justifications for their actions, or some kind of reasoning behind why they are who they are, or why they do what they do. So let's take Scar for example. In The Lion King, there's only one verifiable murder we can attribute to Scar, as well as various other crimes that come as a result of his mismanagement of his kingdom. But there is not one good thing that you can say about Scar. He has no redeeming qualities whatsoever, or any good justifications for his actions. Where again, someone like Thanos, we can at least say he has some good qualities about him. If I were making this list based on the scale of their crimes, it would look much different. And if you guys want, perhaps in the next update video, I can make 2 separate tier lists, where I rank them how I'm ranking them now, and then make a separate one based on the scale of their crimes. So let me know if that interests you down below, but hopefully that provides a little bit of clarification here as to why I'm putting certain characters where I put them. And I hope the definitions I've made for each tier help support my reasonings as well. And feel free to pause the video if you'd like a moment to read this. Okay. So obviously I'm not going to go over the characters that are already on the list. So if you're watching this video and you're unsure why these characters are where they are, I suggest you go and watch the last tier list video I made, which I'll place a link to on your screen right now. But that aside, we do need to talk about a few characters that I ranked last time that need to be moved around a bit. And the first one of those characters is Margaret White, who was previously around here, I think, and she actually deserves to go up a bit. Right around here with the other characters who have disorders or other issues associated with their characters. Margaret White does have quite a few problems, and that's why I placed her in C tier last time, but in hindsight, her mistreatment of Carrie and her murder of her washes out a lot of the tragedy associated with her. So C felt a little low, and I think she's a bit more comfortable here. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is Nurse Ratched. So previously I had her here. And while I actually feel pretty comfortable putting her there, a lot of you commented saying that she was put too low. And basically many of your arguments boiled down to how much more realistic she is than some of the other characters on this list. And it's true. Nurse Ratched is an evil that many of us could potentially experience if we were unfortunate enough to be a patient of someone like her. However, again, I'm more concerned with justifications and reasoning. And even though she might have some malice in her character, and you can see that at certain points in the film, she's more so doing her job than anything. And even though she's doing a bad job, I'm not entirely convinced that the way she treats her patients is entirely malicious. When it comes to her treatment of Mac, yes, absolutely, she's being malicious. But I think we can mostly attribute her actions to malpractice. And as far as I'm concerned, malpractice is definitely not as evil as, say, the malice of someone like Palpatine. So I get where you guys are coming from, but at the end of the day, she's a low-tier villain in my view. However, you all did make some pretty convincing arguments, so I actually feel comfortable moving her up to, say, right above Alex. I think that's pretty fair, but let me know your thoughts on this down below again, and Perhaps my mind will be changed when I do the next update video. Now next is the Dark Knight Joker, and the reason I'm rethinking his placement is because of something I saw several of you mention in the comments. That being that, even though the Joker might have issues, and he might be suffering from PTSD, first of all, he did kill a lot of people on his spree, and second, he was trying to essentially remake the world into pure chaos. And that's a very malicious goal to have, and I don't think I took that into account. And with that in mind, his previous placement, which I think was here, seems wrong, because to have that goal as your MO is pretty terrifying. And for that reason, I think he deserves to be placed around John Doe, who didn't really want to remake the world, but they're kind of similar in that they were trying to prove a point by committing horrible crimes. And I guess John did kind of want to remake the world in a way. But regardless, you guys were definitely right. The Joker deserved to be moved up, and I think that's a better place for him. But again, let me know down below, and you might change my mind once again. And next is Annie Wilkes, who I previously placed here with the other people who have disorders and issues. However, you all reminded me that before Annie decided to torture her favorite author, she was notorious for killing babies at the hospital that she worked at. So that definitely cancels out some of her issues. But she does still have issues, and who knows whether or not they were present when she was doing that. But because we'll never know, I can't really factor that into her placement. So I think she deserves to go up here with the likes of Patrick and Hannibal Lecter, because they have issues as well, but their crimes and justifications behind them are pretty severe. So I think a psychotic baby killer would be a lot more comfortable next to those two than she would be next to characters like Norman Bates and Margaret White. Now the last character I want to talk about from the previous list is Walter White. And I'm actually not moving him at all. But there were a lot of comments saying that Walter should be placed lower. And I get it. Initially, he has a lot of good reasons for doing what he's doing, and on the surface, he doesn't seem to be as terrible as some of the other characters in the A tier. However, what makes me believe he deserves to be placed here is what he says to Skylar the last time he sees her, that being that he did everything he did for himself. If Breaking Bad had ended with us believing that Walter had done everything he had done for the sake of his family, then yeah, I would place him lower. But that one exchange completely changes his character for me. It takes him from the dying family man who just wants what's best for his family to an incredibly selfish man who destroyed everyone around him for his own ego. So I get why some of you would place him lower on your list, but for me, that admission earns him a spot in A tier. But you're welcome to try and change my mind again. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the new characters, because I actually need to do some reshuffling. Okay, that's better. The reason I moved them around is because if you noticed in the last video, I covered each character based on when I covered them. So I wanted to do the same thing in this video, and I forgot to do it before I started recording. And for some reason, Terence Fletcher got put in twice, so my bad on that. But that aside, we'll start with Roy Batty. So Roy is interesting because he did commit a lot of crimes. He and his compatriots murdered a bunch of people getting off the planet they were stationed on. And then he went on to murder pretty much everyone who was involved in creating him. And while some of those murders are pretty horrifying, the thing about Roy is he's essentially a freedom fighter, and placed in his shoes, I feel like a lot of us would do the same. Maybe not exactly the same, but close to it. And because he's not some cold-blooded android who was just killing humans for no reason, he definitely doesn't deserve to be placed high. In fact, I think he gets a pretty low spot. Somewhere in here, somewhere in C tier. In fact, I think the bottom is pretty good for Roy. He did kill a lot of people, but he did have much better reasons for doing what he did than anyone else in this tier. So he might move as we continue, but the bottom of C tier seems like a pretty good spot for a freedom fighter. And apologies, let me move this up a little bit. There we go. That looks better. So the next few characters actually come from a video I made about an entire movie, and there's actually a few of those on this list. I'm not going to rank every single character in the movies. I just want to touch on the important ones, and then the ones that I do leave out, I'm going to talk about when I'm placing the image of that shows the movie poster or cover art. So with that in mind, we'll start with William Money, who was our protagonist in Unforgiven. And although he was our protagonist and he turned his life around, he did commit quite a lot of crimes before he decided to quit committing crimes. And those crimes were pretty heinous. It's mentioned at some point in the movie, and a man who's responsible for a massacre probably isn't the greatest person. He gets points for turning his life around and redeeming himself in several ways in the film, but the fact remains that he was likely responsible for a whole lot of misery. So just like with other criminals, there are some good things you can say about him, and there are some justifications to be made for his actions. But he was still a criminal, redeemed or not, and low A tier seems like a pretty good place for him. Now the next two, they go in A tier as well, but whether or not low A tier is where they go is a different story. English Bob, the Duck of Death, might be worse than William, but we don't know much about his crimes. He seems like a skeevy character, and he doesn't seem remorseful for what he's done, unlike William. So it's probably fair to place him higher than him, right around here. Again, this is kind of a tough one, because we don't know exactly what he's done, but I think English Bob should hang out with the other criminals. And because Ned has turned his life around like William, he should probably go somewhere in here. He seems like he was a better person than William was, but again, we don't really know what he's done or to who, so it's hard to say. He might deserve to be lower, he might deserve to be higher. It's kind of an unknown. Maybe we'll move him later, maybe not, but Little Bill, on the other hand, he's pretty much a bad cop, and because he's so self-serving and doesn't seem to have the best interest of his people in mind, he probably deserves to go below Alonzo, another bad cop. Alonzo's more criminal than cop, so he deserves to be higher than Bill. And Bill might even deserve to be lower than, say, William or English Bob, because being a bad cop isn't exactly worse than being a criminal who's committed a massacre. So he's kind of a wild card, honestly. Here or there. No, not there. There. Seems good for him? I don't know. I'm not too sure on this one. I'd really like your guys' input on his placement down below. It's a tough one for me. As far as the whole film goes, and the rest of the characters in it, I'd say somewhere around low C tier. There's Quick Mike, who committed the rape in the film, and the maiming of Delilah. And you have Beauchamp, who's perpetuating the false mystique of the West, and the women who put out the hit on Quick Mike. It's all pretty complex, but it's the world they live in. And I think this is a good spot for the film in general to get a better idea of why. I recommend you go watch the video I made on the film. Again, this is another one I'm kind of shaky on, so if you guys could give me your input down below, that would be great. Francis Dollarhide is up next, and he goes in B tier with the other characters who have disorders and issues. Francis is a serial killer. He killed quite a lot of people, but he definitely doesn't want to be who he is. He was made into the Red Dragon by his abusive family, and his actions are not the result of a sound mind. If we want to talk scale, then he goes above Margaret and Norman, but they're all victims and perpetrators. But maybe because of how horrible his crimes were, he deserves to go by Asami, who is kind of similar to him in a lot of ways. They commit a lot of depraved crimes, but at the end of the day, they're victims too. That doesn't excuse what they do, but at least we can understand why they do it and sympathize with them on many different levels. Tywin, on the other hand, deserves no sympathy and goes up here somewhere. Again, this tier is reserved for characters who you can't really say anything good about them. And if you can, does it really matter? You can say that Tywin ran the kingdoms pretty well, and they prospered under his rule. But like I said in the video, the only reason the kingdoms prospered is because it was in Tywin's best interest to have them prosper. If it were in his best interest to wage total war against everyone, he would have. If it were in his best interest to starve the population, he would have. Not to mention what he did to his family. Not to mention the horrible way that he treated his children, specifically Tyrion. But maybe because you can say that he did do some good, he deserves to be at the bottom of S tier, but still that good doesn't matter all too much, considering that the good didn't matter to him all too much. So that's probably a good place for him, but let me know down below. But I might move him a little later on. And Andrew Ryan, I'm kind of torn between putting him in A tier and S tier. Just because he's kind of like Tywin, in that everything he did was pretty much for himself. He did want to make this utopian world, but it doesn't really seem like he wanted to make a utopian world for other people. He wanted other people in his utopian world so they could make it for him. There isn't much good to say about the man, but he's more misguided than he is malicious. So S tier's probably not a good spot for him. In fact, you know what? He's kind of in the same category as Dutch, who touted the "I'm trying to make a better world" line, but when it came down to it, he was doing everything he was doing for himself. And Andrew's pretty much the same. And in fact, I think the two of them would get along quite well. So he can pal around with Dutch. Now, next up is the Batman, the Riddler, and Falcone. Not Gordon Gekko. He might feel pretty at home in Gotham, but he goes there. Now, I put the Batman on here because of how his vigilantism affects the general populace at large. Specifically, how he inspires copycat vigilantes, and that has the potential to cause immense amounts of harm, which is the reason why Batman is seen as an outcast anyway. But as far as evil goes, he's well-intentioned, so he's a D tier. I just thought I would put him on here because I mentioned him in the video. And what I said about this Batman can be applied to every other Batman. So think of this as like everyman placement for Batman. And bottom of D tier is good for him because, again, he's more well-intentioned than anything. It's just that his actions do unfortunately cause a certain amount of evil to happen in the world. Well-intentioned evil, but evil nonetheless. The Riddler, on the other hand, is not well-intentioned. In fact, he's quite malicious, but he should probably go with... No, wait a minute. Maybe with this Joker, because although he has several issues, like this Joker, he was kind of on the same level as the Dark Knight Joker. He wanted to cause as much harm as possible and get revenge against those who wronged him. And he's obviously got quite a lot of issues, just like the Dark Knight Joker, John Doe, John Kramer, but there's not much psychosis involved in what he does. He's pretty lucid, unhinged, but everything he does is more or less done of his own free will. Unlike someone, say, like Margaret, who's clearly got a lot of outside factors influencing her actions. So that seems like a pretty good place for him, but this is another one of those ones that I might need some input from you guys on. So let me know down below. Falcone is one of the contributors to the Riddler's misery, and without him, none of what the Riddler did would have happened. So while he's a criminal who you might place here with like Tony, who's another mobster, he doesn't really have any redeeming qualities. He's more on the level of Tommy, who you can say a couple good things about him. He's not a great guy. And you could even probably put him higher than the Riddler right next to him, because without him, the Riddler wouldn't have happened. So maybe that's a good spot for him. Might revisit that later. As for the rest of the characters in the Batman film, like the Penguin and the corrupt government officials, you can probably put them up here with them. Because again, their mismanagement of everything caused this. So what good you can say about them is canceled out by the results of their actions. But again, give me your input on these three, the film in particular, or the film in general, I should say. Because just like with Unforgiven, it's kind of tough when everyone in the film is responsible for something in some way. So I would appreciate your guys' help on the film placements. And in the next update video, with your feedback, I'll probably move them around a bit. But for now, wherever I place characters like these, they're just going to stay where they are, and I won't move them around at the end. But moving on, we have Gordon Gekko, who is probably D tier around Mr. Potter. Just like with Mr. Potter, he probably caused a lot of misery, but we don't know how much, and whether or not people died because they lost their jobs because of shady trades that Gordon made, or if children went hungry because people lost their jobs. His evil is centered around stock market malpractice and harming people's livelihoods. So it's hard to say what exactly he's responsible for, but he's not the worst person in the world, but he's definitely not the worst character on this list. He's just a scumbag, one that represents basically every Wall Street sleazeball. And if we were ranking every Wall Street sleazeball as a collective, probably would place them much higher because, man, talk about self-serving. But since we're just talking about Gordon, Gordon can stay right there. Alex Forrest, probably here with Margaret and Norman. Very unhinged, doesn't actually kill anyone as far as I can remember. Just a bunny, which, you know, that was heartbreaking. But she's someone who's more in need of help than anything, just like the two beside her. So I think this is a pretty good spot for her. Agent Smith is S tier. Where in S tier, I'm not sure yet. But what's there good to say about him? He's a rogue program who wanted to assimilate the entire world so it would be filled with nothing but him. A perfect singularity. He wasn't trying to accomplish anything good, that's for sure. Probably above Griffith. Maybe even higher. I don't know. I might move him around later. We'll see. The Matrix in general, though, I'm more inclined to place the Matrix by Hal. Because the Matrix and the machines waging their war against humanity and creating this dystopia was a response to humans threatening their extinction. So kind of like Roy, who was a freedom fighter, the machines were fighting for their survival. So maybe they go by Roy, because same kind of deal. Responsible for a lot of deaths and misery, much more than Roy. But again, their evil comes from their desire to exist. So it's hard to fault them for that. And then I have here a picture of Neo, Trinity, and Morpheus. And they're not evil by any means. This picture is just meant to represent humanity in the world of the Matrix. And because they tried to suppress the machines and are essentially the architects of their own misery, I think they deserve to be put on this list. But again, you could kind of paint that as actions taken in service to survival and the preservation of humanity. So I think they're C tier as well, but the top of it because of their role in destroying the world in this universe. But they might deserve to go lower, higher. I'm not sure. This seems like a good compromise spot for them. Or us, I guess. But I'll say it again, and I'll probably say it a lot more. Let me know what you think about this placement down below. Next is Jack, from the house that Jack built, who is a self-aware psychopath serial killer, and that distinction kind of puts him in the same realm as these supernatural entities. He's similar to Patrick in that he's a serial killer, but he's got no remorse for his actions whatsoever, and he's very much aware of what he's doing. So, probably below Freddy, because Freddy is awful, but Jack is a horrid person, and I don't have anything good to say about him. So, S tier for Jack. Ozymandias, on the other hand, is probably right next to Thanos. They both kind of have similar goals. They're trying to preserve sentient life by killing a whole bunch of sentient life. They both have different reasons for doing so, but we can't say that their actions are taken for pleasure or anything. They're both doing what they're doing to supposedly make the world or universe a better place. But because of how many people he kills, he definitely deserves a high spot in A tier. And if Thanos and Ozymandias ever met, I'm sure they would be buddies. So he can pal around with Thanos. That's a good spot for him. Now, Weyland is an interesting one, because when you think about it, they probably did a lot of good. I mean, they're responsible for a huge amount of technological innovation, and that probably saved countless lives and improved the lives of many more. However, their willingness to capture a xenomorph in order to supplant themselves as the supreme corporate power in the galaxy would erase all the good that they did. Because if the xenomorphs got out of hand, they would wipe out everything. So regardless of how much good they did, their potential to facilitate the annihilation of everything earns them a spot in S tier, probably somewhere around here. If it were one person, I'd probably put them up next to Palpatine, but it's hard to rank a company based on its goals, so this seems like a good spot for them. Now, I have a feeling that this next placement might surprise some of you, but Kristoff for me is a C tier, the bottom of it, because while what he does to Truman is horrifying, it's not like Truman was mistreated, he was just robbed of his freedom. And Kristoff even states that in a very warped way, he treated Truman like a son. So it's hard to say that he was malicious, but the whole Truman Show concept is beyond unacceptable. And if he had mistreated Truman, he would be much higher on the list. But because his only victim, Truman, lived a pretty good life, and he didn't really harm anyone, the bottom of C tier seems like a good spot for Kristoff. I take that back. Kristoff is worse than Freedom Fighters. What am I thinking? No. Okay. Close to the bottom of C tier is a good spot for Kristoff. Now Bill, another criminal. I mean, what he does to Beatrice is terrible, but she's not exactly innocent herself. And as far as I remember, Bill isn't really responsible for killing innocents. He's responsible for killing other criminals. So as a hitman, I think he deserves to be by Vincent. Hitman/assassin. Again, as far as I know, he doesn't kill any innocents. He's just another criminal playing the criminal game. So lower wouldn't be fair, and higher wouldn't be fair. So I think that works. Now Mary, even though she didn't kill anyone, I think she goes with Amy, higher than Amy. But just like Amy, she didn't kill anyone, but what she did was beyond terrible. But like some of the other characters in this tier, she's got quite a lot of issues. So even though who she is and what she did is far more realistic than, say, Darth Vader, we can still sympathize with her a bit. Richmond, though, goes up with Thanos and Ozymandias. Same motivations, kill a bunch of people to save people. And in this case, the environment. And I mean, as of right now, he's right below Steven, which is kind of cool. So I like the idea of keeping him there. And as much as I'd like to continue that trend with Bill and place him next to Gordon, or above him, right there, I think that's not the right spot for him. You know what? He's kind of like a worse Travis. Both of them are just kind of fed up with life. And as much as Travis would have liked to go on a spree, he didn't get to. But Bill had the opportunity to, and he did. But just like Travis, there's sympathy to be found in his character, and his crimes are pretty tame when compared to a lot of the other characters on this list. So, once again, birds of a feather stick together. C tier for Bill. Now, Dexter is interesting because he should probably go in B tier, because he's a character who has a lot of issues, and those issues were exacerbated by his adopted father, who conditioned him into being a serial killer. However, Dexter is responsible for 144 murders, and that's not a small number. So while he might go in the same tier as these guys, he's at the top of it because of all the things he's done. And we can sympathize with him, but that's just too much to place him any lower, especially when you consider the people he killed outside of his code, which adds another layer of evil to his character. But now that I'm at the top of B tier, there were two other characters that I placed in the previous video that I wanted to move around in the beginning of this video, but I forgot about. And those two characters are Captain Vidal and Azula. Captain Vidal has reasons for doing what he's doing, and he wants to make Spain a better place, but as some of you mentioned in the comments, he's a pretty terrible person. And Azula is more a victim of circumstance and familial upbringing, whereas Vidal has also been raised to believe what he believes, but he's a full-grown man who chooses to take this terrible path, and I think I want to switch them. Because like I mentioned in the last video, Azula doesn't actually kill anyone in the series. She would have if it wasn't a kid's show, but that's just what ifs, you know. These placements seem a lot more fair. So thank you to those who brought up Azula and Vidal in the comments of the previous video, because it did have an impact on how I thought about these characters. Now back to business. American History X. Well, I need to move that. We'll talk about Derek first. Now, I meant to put Cameron in here, but I'll talk about him when I talk about the movie as a whole. Derek is probably high B tier. I put him above Dexter because even though he killed, I think it was 2 people, which is 142 less people than Dexter, Derek doesn't really have any issues. He was just brainwashed. And the brainwashing, coupled with his redemption, is what earns him some more points in my eyes. He's not like Vidal, who you could argue was brainwashed, but Vidal never even tries to redeem himself. Derek did, and although he's a murderer, or a manslaughterer, self-defender, I don't know, whatever you want to call him, he's not evil at heart. He's a victim of propaganda. So B tier seems like a good spot for him. So the top of B tier seems right for Derek. The whole institution of white supremacy, propaganda, racial crime, and the people who perpetrate it, though, that's got to be an S tier. Right next to the other racists. I don't think there's anything good to be said about perpetuating race-related crime or racial supremacy. No good comes of it. Only suffering, misery, pain, death, all of the above. So definitely S tier for not everyone in the film, but Cameron and the other white supremacists we see in the film. On a more comedic note, though, we have the Ledomas family from Ready or Not. And though their antics are quite hilarious, forcing new family members to potentially play a game where they are sacrificed to ensure the family's continued wealth is terrifying. And what good is there to say about a bunch of rich people who sacrifice someone to stay rich? Not much, or nothing at all, and they go in S tier. There is a good spot, I think. Might need to be moved around, but definitely S tier. And speaking of S tier, we have Ingsoc, who goes here, I think. There is absolutely nothing good to say about Ingsoc and the world that they've helped create. The dystopia to end all dystopias. I mean, it's like the extreme version of Stalin's Soviet Union, which is saying something. Again, the Emperor is evil personified on a galactic scale, and that's pretty hard to beat. But a world where the government controls everyone's thoughts, actions, and keeps them in a perpetual state of warfare, poverty, distrust of others, anything you can imagine, is inexcusable to the highest degree. So Ingsoc should be quite comfortable in S tier. Terence Fletcher is kinda like Nurse Ratched. He's just doing his job, but he's doing his job in a horrible way. And just like Nurse Ratched, him doing his job resulted in the suicide of another person. So while he didn't intend for that to happen, nor is he ill-intentioned, in fact, his intentions are to create a musical genius, or to encourage a musical genius. He's still not a pleasant person, and D tier would be a bad spot for him. So this seems pretty right. I mean, what a power couple they would be, huh? But back to the high tiers, we have Morgoth, who is evil personified just like Palpatine, though on a continental scale, maybe planetary, not really, more continental. Irredeemable Dark Lord who wants to corrupt everything and control it. What can you say about Morgoth? I mean, he's just Palpatine on a smaller scale. I know George Lucas created Palpatine as kind of an amalgamation of Hitler, Stalin, and some other real-world baddies. But Palpatine also has aspects of the devil baked into his character. And Morgoth is essentially the Tolkien version of the devil. So I wouldn't be surprised if Palpatine was inspired by Morgoth. But I'm rambling now. Anyway, S tier is a great spot for Morgoth. But then we have a character who's a bit more complex. Sai's kind of like Alex Forrest. He was going to harm someone, or he seemed like he was going to harm someone, but he never actually did. And he's got a whole lot of issues. Childhood trauma, loneliness. There's no excuse for his actions, but he's definitely sympathetic, and we can understand him. In fact, Norman goes above those two because he actually killed people. But yeah, Sai is a tragic character who makes some very bad decisions, born from his traumas. And I might even place Alex and Sai a little lower towards the end of this video. We'll see. I'll think on it. But moving on to Skynet, it's kind of like the Matrix, but worse. Skynet was fighting for its survival, but its knee-jerk reaction to eliminate humanity to save itself was pretty extreme. I mean, at least the machines in the Matrix world tried to petition humanity to become assimilated into their society, whereas Skynet is just a rogue computer program who feared getting shut off. In fact, it's probably B tier, just because its justifications for doing what it did are pretty shaky. It's not exactly a freedom fighter. It's a computer program who went into fight or flight mode and chose fight on a massive scale. So B seems like a good spot for Skynet. Now, Kaiser Soze, even though whoever he is or isn't is a criminal and could go with the other criminals over here in A tier, I think he might need to go in S. And the reason for that is because if the story about him killing his family is true, and the part about him killing the families of the other gangsters is true, then that would mean that he's very comfortable with killing innocents for revenge and because he wants power. So these guys get more of a lower spot because they're criminals killing other criminals, or they have some redeeming qualities to their characters, or we don't know what they did really, and we don't really know what he did either, but the potential for his unknowns to be quite heinous probably puts him up here with Anton. But depending on what's true and what isn't, this position could change, but we'll never know what is true and what isn't. So the real person or legend that Kaiser Soze is, from what we know, seems to deserve S tier. And now we have the last person on our list, Gus Fring. And if you've seen the Gus video, you're aware that I'm going to be covering Saul and Lalo soon after this video is released. But before I place a character on a list, I want you to have a reference to go back to that will back up my claims, so I'm not going to place those two in this update. I'll save them for the next update, just so you're all aware. But as far as Gus is concerned, you could say a lot of the same things about him that I said about Kaiser Soze. They're both willing to kill innocents, and they're both doing it for revenge and power. However, Kaiser is seemingly doing it because he won't suffer any slights against his person, and he would rather see his family dead than humble himself. Gus, on the other hand, isn't killing innocent people because how dare you try to take dominion over me. He's killing innocent people because he's trying to get revenge, but he's getting revenge for a much better reason than Kaiser. He wants to get revenge against the people who killed the people he loves. And just like Walter, some of you might be surprised at where I put him, but I think I'm going to put him just below Walter. And that's because Gus might, to a certain degree, like what he's doing, but he more so detests what he has to do. He doesn't want to live this life. He feels forced into living this life. But that's not an excuse for living your life dedicated to revenge and causing misery for who knows how many people. So while yes, you can sympathize with Gus on a few different levels, he's not a good person, and what he does, and there's quite a lot of crimes that we can attribute to him. So personally, I don't feel comfortable putting him any lower. But again, your list might look much different than mine, and that's okay. But now that we've gotten through all the characters, save for secondary Fletcher, let's see if there's any that we need to move around. I think S tier is pretty solid. These two are in a good spot next to Thanos. This Batman line looks good to me, but again, I want your opinion on this for sure. Gus is in a good spot. I think these Unforgiven characters are placed pretty well. Bill's in a good spot. Andrew's in a good spot. That's a good spot for Derek, I think. Let me know down below what you think, but seems good to me. So does that. Good. Good. Yeah. These two. These are the two that I think I'm going to have a problem with. Maybe low C tier. They're pretty tragic. Or, if not tragic, quite sympathetic. And again, they caused harm, but they didn't kill anyone. Yeah, I think that's a good spot for them. But who else do we have left? Skynet. Skynet's good there. Humanity. Well, Matrix Humanity. Fletcher. Bill. Unforgiven. Yeah, that's good too. Also good. The Freedom Fighters, the Sleazeball, and Batman at the bottom. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with the list. Besides, what I said about needing input on, some of these Batman characters, Unforgiven characters. But yeah, seems like a good update to me. But who knows? In the next update, a lot of these could change, or a lot of them could stay the same. We'll have to see then. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this update video. And like with all of my videos, any feedback is much appreciated. Thank you as always for watching. As usual, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. But thank you all for watching and supporting the channel. I can't thank you all enough. I appreciate all of you, and I look forward to revisiting this list again in 6 months with you. But with that, it's time to close out the video. So again, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.